There's an old saying that everyone has a story to tell, everyone has a book to write. But there's another old saying as well, that outside of a dog, a book is your best friend. And inside of a dog, it's too dark to read. Yes, today on Dragon's Teeth, we're taking our first look at how to become a self-published author. Hi, I'm Rob Poyton. Thanks for joining me today in the first of our series in looking at becoming a self-published author. I'm going to take you step by step through the processes of not only the, if you like, the craft and creative side of writing. How do you come up with ideas? How do you put plots together? That sort of thing. But also the practical elements such as design, layout. What is the actual process of getting your book from on your computer out into bookshops or Amazon or whatever else you want to do with it. As it happens at the moment, you might know if you follow the channel that I have two writing projects on the go. Well, two that are properly on the go. There's always another three or four sort of knocking round as well. But there's two that are well underway. In fact, one is nearing completion. On the fiction side, there's my novel Queen of the Fens, which is the first in a trilogy, and that is a sequel to the Robert E. Howard story Worms of the Earth, set in Roman Britain. The second project is my fantasy skirmish rule set, We Want the Gold. Obviously, that's, well, I suppose it's non-fiction in a sense, isn't it? In that it's a technical book, it's a set of wargame rules, even though it's about a fictional subject. So that is a slightly different approach, of course. We've got to think about how we get the rules across, how the book is structured, there's tables involved, what sort of artwork we're going to use, that sort of thing. So two slightly contrasting projects, but hopefully with those, we're covering both fact and fiction. I have quite a long background in writing. I was reading at an early age. I was able to read before I went to school. Our house was full of two things, books and music. So it was great growing up with that. And yeah, I was reading from a young age. And as a kid, I remember reading, Treasure Island, The Three Musketeers, Gulliver's Travels, The Famous Five, all these kinds of things. Stig of the Dump, of course. And one of the best things we had, literally just around the corner from where I used to live, was the local library. So it was very rare that I wasn't reading at least one book. I always enjoyed writing as a kid as well. English was my favourite lesson at school. And I actually got second prize in a national writing competition when I think it was about 8 or 9 or something like that. So I can't really remember too much about that. It was a very long time ago. And in fact, while still at senior school, this would have been late 70s, early 80s, of course, we had the whole punk new wave thing going on at that time, which was very much a do-it-yourself attitude. And one thing that came out of that were fanzines. Now, there had been fanzines around for a long time, of course, particularly in the area of weird fiction and horror, funnily enough. But now we started getting music fanzines talking about bands, politics, that kind of stuff. So I think I was about 16, 17, and myself and a school friend Dave decided to put out our own fanzine called The Outsider, mostly focusing on the local music scene, but we got to interview some people like The Jam, Paul Weller, for example, and a few other things as well. And that was literally us putting that together on typewriters, Letraset, getting it printed. I'm not sure. I think we borrowed a photocopier, got it stapled up, and we were selling that out at school and also through local record shops and that kind of stuff. Also, about that time, I got into playing, well, I've been wargaming for a little while. I got into RPGs, and this is where I started. Well, first of all, I wrote my own rule set, Shadle Manor, because we couldn't get hold of Dungeons and Dragons. It's quite surprising to hear that now, perhaps, but back in the day, it was a very mysterious, almost arcane thing. There are probably just one or two shops in London that sold it. So I wrote my own RPG. Then, of course, we actually got AD&D and started playing that. And one thing I liked about that was, yes, you had the rules and scenarios, but you could adapt the rules if you wanted. And of course, you could write your own scenarios. So that is something I started getting into, particularly for Call of Cthulhu. Another form of writing I was into back then was song lyrics. I joined my first band just as I left school, and for about, I guess, 7, 8 years, I was, well, semi-professional for a little while, but was always playing in various bands, which meant, of course, writing songs. That's something that I picked up again about, well, probably about 12 years ago now, maybe even more than that. Now, that is a form of writing, of course, along with poetry, for example, but it's not something I'm going to go into on this series. We're going to stick to writing fiction and fact. Speaking of which, in the mid-80s and into the 90s, I was editor of 2 Tai Chi magazines, and I also started writing articles for a lot of the martial arts magazines, some of the health and fitness magazines. I had 1 or 2 little pieces in things like Men's Health and various other publications. I never really thought about putting books out because back at that time, self-publishing wasn't really a thing. Well, you could do it. I guess like we did with the fanzine, you could produce something yourself. You could go to a local printer, you could put your book together, you could take it to a local printer, but chances were they'd say like, well, you've got to print at least 200 copies. You know, and we all know what happens. You end up with 180 copies in your shed. And how do you get this distributed? Again, you're back to that fanzine idea of I'm taking it round to local shops or whatever. So it wasn't really such an option. It wasn't until we got into the 2000s, and I guess the rise of the digital age in particular, that self-publishing became an actual thing. Now, before we go any further, I just want to talk about this for a little bit, because I think things have changed a lot, but there still is sometimes an element of people looking down on or being quite sort of snobby about self-publishing, as though you're not a proper author if you're self-publishing. Vanity publishing, that's the phrase that is sometimes thrown at it. That's not really something that I've ever subscribed to, because again, if I go back to earlier times, we look at that punk new wave movement that came out, and that was all about people doing their own thing. You know, if EMI wouldn't sign you up, then your mate said, well, I'll set up a record label. And this is how we got all these things like Stiff and Rough Trade and all the rest of it. People setting up their own labels, people doing their own thing and publishing. And that was an era for me, looking back, of great creativity, not just in music, but across all the arts, I think. So I came up with that sort of attitude of do it yourself, really. And we all know that whether it's in music or whether it's in writing, if you're going to wait for one of the big companies to sign you up, you're most likely going to have a very, very, very long wait. And this is something that annoys me a little bit still, is when I see on writers' forums on Facebook or wherever, people say, well, how do I go about getting my book published? And this idea is you spend 3 years writing your book, then you put it aside for a year, then you come back to it, you spend another year maybe editing it, then you start sending it out to publishers, you wait another couple of years perhaps for all this stuff to go on, and eventually, you know, if all the stars line up, your book gets published. That's like 5 or 6 years. If you've got a reasonable level of fluency in writing and you've got a decent idea, then I would never discourage anyone from self-publishing. And I certainly wouldn't encourage them to sit on their work for years and years in the vain hope that a big-time publisher is going to sign them up. So yeah, with the advent of self-publishing, it became viable for me to publish my own books. And at first I was working in that familiar field for me, martial arts, health, fitness, self-defense, well-being. I started publishing my own books of those. Of course, I had my own school and associated people to sell to. But one of the big game changers also, of course, was the advent of online shopping. Now, we can have a debate on the goods and the bads about companies like Amazon. But the upshot is, as a self-publisher, I can have a book printed, it will go onto Amazon, and someone anywhere in the world can buy that book. It will be printed and sent to them without me having to do anything. Of course, in the meantime, I can also sell my books in person at various events and conventions. I can sell through my own website, but having that global reach through a large company like that, as I say, that really was a game changer. So my non-fiction books were doing well. They were doing okay. I was happy with those. But I had a bit of an itch to go back, I guess, almost back to childhood to start trying some fiction again. I'd also just come out of living in the Fens for a few years, which is an amazingly evocative landscape, and there's tons of local myths and legends around there. So these two things sort of came together, and I wrote my first collection of short stories called Remnants, which was basically my homage to M.R. James and H.P. Lovecraft, those type of stories set out in the Fens. Now, I suppose I did think a bit that having done my martial art books already, this would be pretty straightforward, and I made loads and loads of mistakes. So again, in this series, I'm going to mention some of those mistakes because they're easy things to do, especially if you take things for granted sometimes. And one thing you learn above all else is check everything, check it again, and then guess what? Check it again. Because every writer, or certainly every publisher, will tell you this, even the big time publishers. You can have a book or a story read 30 times and you think you've got every single spelling mistake. Soon as you get that printed copy, and I've seen this even in a friend of mine, page one, the with two E's or something, and it just, it's like a searchlight. It just screams out at you. How did everyone miss that? So we will be going through all those mistakes I made as well. Hopefully you'll be able to avoid them. Anyway, despite my errors, Remnants did okay. I got some nice reviews. I got some good feedback. I also got some constructive feedback as well. That's something I really do like getting. It's nice when people say, yeah, I really enjoyed that. Of course, you're always going to get someone who says, that's crap. Well, okay, all right, that's your opinion. But what I find much more useful is something like, yeah, it was okay, but I think it would have been better if. That's always very helpful advice and feedback. So I'll be talking about reviews and that kind of thing as we go on as well. So having taken that first step with Remnants, I have since published, well, quite a number of fiction books. I've got my Sword and Sorcery series, The Wolf Who Would Be King. I'm going to be starting work on the next one later this year. I've got a number of short story collections out, such as Innsmouth Echoes. I've published some novels and novellas, a crime thriller set in East London in the 80s, a couple of military sci-fi novels that I really must get back to those at some time. I've also curated a number of anthologies of Lovecraftian stories. In fact, we've built up a very nice little circle of writers now, and this is another thing I'll be touching on. As much as you can, do get support from other authors as well. Generally speaking, 99%, I found it's been a very supportive community. Through that, I've also had some of my short stories published in other people's collections, such as Eldritch Investigations, Shadows over Doggerland, and how could we not mention the dreaded Nookinomicon, of course. I think Nookinomicon 2 is on the cards as well. That might be out soon. That's my writing history then, in a nutshell, quite a large nutshell. One other thing I would mention is that I'm quite lucky in that in one of my previous jobs, when I used to have a real job, I was trained up in desktop publishing. Long story short, I was working for the Crown Prosecution Service and they were looking to put a department together, the Management Information Unit. Part of the job of that department was to put out a newsletter for all the local offices. So the call went up, does anyone know anything about computers? and desktop publishing, and I put my hand up because it sounded like quite a cushy number, and it was, to be fair. Uh, so through that, I got trained in desktop publishing and one or two other things as well. Also, just prior to that, I had worked in the marketing department as a copywriter for a music company. So I had a little bit of experience in that field as well. And my wife, Lara, is a graphic designer and a very talented artist. In that sense, I'm very fortunate in that we can keep all that stuff in-house, which is great from not only an expense point of view, but also, sometimes you might give someone a brief and what you get back is quite far removed from what you had in mind. When you do all that in-house, that issue doesn't really arise. That's not to say we don't have arguments over breakfast about which font to use as a header or something. So, there's always that. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with two questions today because these are fundamental. Now, some of the stuff here we're covering will be the same as the podcast, really, because before you start anything in terms of self-publishing, whatever avenue you're going down, podcast, filming, YouTube channel, books, whatever it is, then you've got to have the subject, right? So, what are you writing about? What is the idea? Is this fiction? Is it work of fiction? Do you have a great idea for a new fantasy novel, a horror story, or something like that? So it might be a novel, it might be a short story, but you have to have that initial germ of an idea. Of course, it could be non-fiction. We helped my father-in-law a couple of years back write his memoirs, for example. So this was his life story, in effect, growing up, what happened during the war, all the way through up to the present day. Now, that wasn't going to be put out into the shops and everything else. That was really for family and friends. I think we had about 50 copies published. So that really leads us into our second question. You've got this idea for what you want to write. Who is it for? Who do you think is going to be reading it? If it's a non-fiction book, obviously you have a set audience in mind. Perhaps you're going to do a book on motorcycle maintenance, right? Obviously, that's a specific target audience. Now, it might be that you're a bit of a name in the local motorcycle world, motorcycle clubs and all that sort of thing. Perhaps you're the person people come to get advice on fixing their bikes. So you then think, right, I've got my audience there. That means when I come to publish this book, I can promote it to that crowd. Perhaps they've got a forum, perhaps they've got a web page, you've got a community basically that you can sell your book to. This is the way it worked for me because obviously in my non-fiction work, I had a target audience in mind. I had a lot of contacts in that area. I was reasonably well known through my magazine articles. So I've got a bit of a ready-made audience there. And even when it came into the fiction with the Lovecraft stuff, I'm co-presenter of the Innsmouth Book Club podcast. So you get to know a lot of people. People get to know you. If they like the podcast and then they see that I've put a book out or a collection of stories, then that's something they might be interested in. So in a way, not really through any planning because I'm not much of a planner, I sort of grew my audience before I started publishing. Again, purely by chance, I guess. I will talk about planning as well because I have some very definite thoughts on that, but that's for later on. So if you do want to get into writing and publishing, now it might be you just want to publish one book. It might be you've got a whole series in mind, all sorts of things. Then there's your first step. Sit down with a piece of paper and a pen. That's always a good start for writing. Write your idea at the top of the page. What is the name of this book going to be? Or short story. Write a short précis underneath. Just a few sentences. Underneath that, write who will want to read this. Because this is going to determine a lot of things later on. How you present your work, where you market it, and so on. That is really the first fundamental step. I can't think of any writer who just sits down and starts writing and hope that something comes out. Music is a little bit different because that can work both ways. You can work something out at home and you take that into the studio with the band and saying, here, I got this song. It goes like this, then there's an instrumental break, then it breaks down into this. But also with music, you can either be sitting there yourself strumming your guitar or playing a piano and think, oh, that's a nice chord sequence, that's a nice melody line. Or, of course, you get a group together and you start jamming and something develops from that. I'm not sure there's an equivalent in writing. I've never been a member of any writers group, for example. That might be an interesting exercise to try at one time. It is something we did talk about a little bit within our writing group of, everyone writes like 3 paragraphs or something and the next person continues it on. I think Lovecraft did something like that once. So that could be something to look at. But generally speaking, you get the idea comes first and then you think, right, I've got to sit down and write this. So there we go. That's your homework for today. Oh, did I mention there's going to be homework? Sit down. What's the title? What is the idea? And who is your target audience? Who is going to want to read this? All right. Once we've got that established, we can go on to stage 2 and we'll do that next time. Big thanks for joining me today. I hope you found that useful. And of course, if you do have any comments, questions or suggestions, please do pop them down below or send me an email at dragoteeth@outlook.com. I'll be happy to hear from you. And if you haven't already, please do click the like, share and subscribe buttons. All right, that's it for this time. Keep writing. I'll see you soon.